But it's not only in football where we see these expertise effects, we also see it in horse racing. This is a book called Never Say I Assume by Chin Nam. Chin Nam's the owner of Bart Cummings trained horses, and Bart Cummings is probably the best horse trainer of all time. This is what he had to say about Bart Cummings. You can see his eyes narrowing like a hawk when he watches the horses run, his strong mobile features held in check by a low straight forehead. But he knows what he sees because he's seeing what he knows better than any other trainer on earth. He knows what he sees because he sees what he knows. So we come back to chicken sexing. What does all this have to do with chicken sexing? As I mentioned, the Japanese have historically been better chicken sexers than any other nation. They can identify the sex of chickens very early after the birth of the chick, better than any other country. Now the Americans started to realise this, and they were spending a lot of money feeding the non-productive male chick, and when they could have been feeding the productive female chick. So they decided, instead of putting all this money into feeding the male chick, we'll put some money into research and we'll study the Japanese chicken sexing approach. We'll survey the Japanese chicken sexers and we'll find out everything they know about chicken sexing so we can become expert chicken sexers. So they did their study, they did a lot of surveys, they asked the Japanese how they know the sex of chickens so early after they're born. And the Japanese told them, we just know. They just know. We've probably, at different points in time in our career, we've heard this comment from coaches. It's probably not so common anymore, but 10 years ago, it was a fairly common sort of a question that coaches would ask. I'm a footy coach. What do I need sports science for? So that kind of approach, that kind of mentality almost conjures up an image that it's sports science versus the experts. But it shouldn't be that way at all. Certainly it seems to have been the case with the Moneyball and Scouts Honour approach. This is another book called The Wisdom of Crowds. If we all go to a county fair and there's a jar of jelly beans and we're all asked to estimate the number of jelly beans in a jar, the average of this group will get closer to the actual number of the jelly beans within the jar than any single estimate from any person. So the take-home point there is that diversity is a strength. Asking one person to make decisions all on their own without any other information is a problem. Diversity is a strength, particularly in football teams. So this is a little bit of scientific data that will back up where science can help intuition. We've looked at training load and injury relationships, and I'll just talk you through this data. We've looked at the likelihood of injury or the risk of injury versus the amount of training load. And what you can see here is essentially it's a sigmoidal curve. For higher training load, the greater the injury risk. Now there's a couple of points to have a look at. Firstly, if we look at the pre-season curves, players can handle a lot more training in the pre-season than they can in season. Perhaps not too surprisingly, it makes intuitive sense. But what we can also see is that we can identify acceptable and unacceptable or safe and unsafe training load ranges. And what we can see here is that on the steep part of this curve, very small changes in training load result in very large changes in injury risk, or very large increases in injury risk. So based on this information, we introduced an injury prediction model, if you like, to see if we could use this information to predict non-contact soft tissue injuries before they occurred. This is a little bit of a busy slide, but I'll talk you through it. We've got predicted injury and whether they were injured, predicted injury but no injury, where we've predicted no injury but they actually got injured, or where we've predicted no injury and no injury occurred. From this information we can develop true positives, true negatives, false positives, false negatives, and we can calculate sensitivity and specificity of the injury prediction model. What you can see is that the model was both sensitive and specific. When players exceeded the training load threshold, they were 70 times more likely to sustain a soft tissue injury. But when players were under the training load threshold, they were injured 1/10 as often. Interestingly though, in 2/3 of cases, 66% of the time, a player was highlighted as being at risk of injury and no change was made. And he was subsequently injured. So clearly, the analysis from this scientific approach has a lot more insight, provides a lot more insight than just the intuitive expertise of a conditioning coach making decisions on their own. Okay? So the last slide here is when we have successes and when we have performances that weren't as successful as we like, is it art, is it science, or is it just plain old luck? I think the first take-home point is that it's not science versus intuition. There's heaps of really good examples of sports science making a practical contribution to the coaching practice in the football codes. But what we need to keep in mind is that we need to respect the expertise of the coaches that are out there. They've done their 10 years or their 10,000 hours of practice, and they've spent a fair bit of time playing around with things as well to develop their skills. So it's not science versus intuition. Science actually complements intuition. But in turn, intuition provides some insight where science can't. So I'd just like to thank the organisers for inviting me to present this talk. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, for that presentation. Are there any questions?
Thank you for your presentation. And I have two questions. Do you think tackle skill training should be in the fatigue? Because the figure, the good tackle player, the skill level is going down in the fatigue. So tackle skill training should be in the, fatigue, like after the fitness or something.
So I think I understand your question. Should we perform some skill under fatigue conditions to hopefully transfer that skill to the fatigue of matches? Yes, I think so. It doesn't necessarily mean all of our tackling should be performed under those conditions, but if we go back 15 years, it was always never perform skill under fatigue because it leads to the development of poor practices. But I don't agree with that. I think we need to make our skill sessions game-like. We need to expose players to game-related situations, and part of a game-related situation for rugby league players is fatigue, performing skillfully under fatigue.
Yeah, because now in Japan, maybe tackle skill always in the normal or like a fresh.
Yes.
So, okay, thank you. And one more question is, do you think any other information, something like not just visual information, something like auditory information is useful for the decision making? Do you know what I mean?
So game-specific auditory information or non-specific?
Game session, in the game session,
So crowd noise and...
no, something like communication from the behind player. Because rugby, it's, support player always, from the behind.
Yes, sure.
And
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I have the complete answer, but from a practical point of view, if Melbourne Storm are probably one team over a long period of time who have dominated the competition, and they have a very strong relationship between their dummy half, their hooker, and their fullback. And anecdotally, we believe that the fullback provides tips to the dummy half, is tipping the dummy half to jump out so that he can play off the back of the dummy half's work. So if the dummy half doesn't see what's evolving in front of him, then sometimes the fullback is telling him and he's calling a play that they've rehearsed a number of times before, but they do it very often. It's a consistent play. So we think that the communication there is fairly important.
okay, thank you.